Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 3, Chapter 3 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. The book is about to get really heavy with torture and graphic depictions, so I hope you guys can stomach it, because let's follow through and see exactly what happens to Winston at the Ministry of Love. Shall we? This chapter starts out with Winston strapped to another table, but this time with looser straps against his body. As he's gaining consciousness, O'Brien states that there are 3 stages to reintegration. There is learning, understanding, and then acceptance. It is now time for Winston to move to the second stage. Winston states that some of these sessions that he had lasted either a few hours or a few days, and the breaks in between these sessions could have been anywhere from 2 hours to 2 weeks. He still wasn't sure because, again, inside the Ministry of Love there were no windows to look at the outside world. As Winston is strapped to the table for one of these sessions, O'Brien says to Winston that he knows exactly what Winston is thinking, and Winston is thinking, why is the Ministry of Love even spending the time and trouble on Winston to get him back into society? O'Brien states that when Winston was free, he had the same thoughts that puzzled him. O'Brien states that Winston could grasp the mechanics of society, but not the underlying motives. O'Brien then asks Winston if he remembers writing "I understand how, I don't understand why" into the notebook. O'Brien states that it was when Winston thought about the why that he doubted his own sanity. He then asked Winston after reading Goldstein's book, did it tell him anything that he already did not know? To which Winston asks, "You've read it?" And O'Brien says, yes. He actually says he's collaborated in writing it, and he goes on to state that the notebook is produced individually. Winston asks if the book is true, to which O'Brien says, yes, as a description. The program that sets forth, however, is nonsense. O'Brien states the secret accumulation of knowledge is a gradual spread of enlightenment, ultimately the Proletan rebellion to overthrow the party. O'Brien states this will never happen because the Proletans will not be smart enough to ever revolt against the party, and in fact, there is no way in which the party can be overthrown. The rule of the party is forever. He tells Winston to make that the starting point of all of his thoughts. He then asks Winston to elaborate on why they need to make sure they remain powerful, to which Winston remains silent. Winston then begins to think that he knew in advance what O'Brien would say, that the party did not seek power for its own end, but only for the good of the majority. But it's not power, because men in masks were frail, cowardly creatures who could not endure liberty or face the truth, and must be ruled over and systematically deceived by others who were stronger than themselves. Ultimately, that it is a choice for mankind to choose which kind, either between freedom or happiness, and for a majority of mankind, happiness was the better answer. He goes on to think that the party was the eternal guardian of the weak, a dedicated sect to an evil thing that might produce the occasional good. The worst thing that Winston thought was that when O'Brien said this, Winston would actually believe it. O'Brien knew everything 1,000 times better than Winston ever could. Winston thinks, what can he do against the lunatic who is more intelligent than yourself, who gives your arguments a fair hearing, and then simply persists in his own lunacy? Winston says feebly, you are ruling over us for our own good. He continues, you believe that human beings are not fit to govern themselves, and therefore, and before he can finish, O'Brien pulls a lever and pain shoots through his body. O'Brien states, that was stupid, Winston. Very stupid. You should have known better than to say a thing like that. O'Brien states, I will now tell you the answer to my question, and it is this. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. They are not interested in the good of others. They are interested solely in power. Not wealth, luxury, long life, happiness, only power. Pure power. He states that they are indifferent from all of the other oligarchies in the fact that after past oligarchies had proceeded to take power, they pretended that once they had the power, just around the corner lay a paradise where human beings are equal and free. The party does not like that. They know that no one in power relinquishes it freely. O'Brien goes on to state, power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard the revolution. One makes the revolution to have the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. After O'Brien says all of this, Winston looks at him in the face and realizes just how old and tired O'Brien must really be. O'Brien can see this and states to Winston that Winston is thinking, I must look really old. O'Brien also states that Winston probably is thinking that he talks so much of power yet is not able to prevent the decay of his own body. But what Winston doesn't understand is that O'Brien is just a cell in the entire organism of the party. O'Brien asks Winston, do you die when you cut your fingernails? After then, O'Brien turns away and begins to stroll up and down with one hand in his pocket. O'Brien goes on to say, I'm going to talk about power and how power is collective. He also states that the individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. He asks Winston, has he never thought that the party slogan "freedom is slavery" could be reversible? But slavery is freedom. O'Brien goes on to explain that when the human being is free, it's always defeated, and it must be so because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete utter submission, if he can escape from his identity, if he can merge himself in the party so that he is the party, then he is all powerful and immortal. He then goes on to state that the second thing for Winston to realize is that power is power over human being, over the body, but above all, over the mind. Power over matter, external reality is what we call it, is not important. Already their control over matter is absolute. As O'Brien is saying this to Winston, Winston gets enough power to get himself into a sitting position and merely succeeded before all the pain shot in his body. Winston asks about how can you control matter. He states you can't even control the climate or the law of gravity, and there are diseases, pain, death. O'Brien silences him by a movement of a hand and a jolt on the lever. O'Brien goes on to say that they control matter because they control the mind. Reality is inside of the skull, and O'Brien states that Winston will learn that there's nothing that the party cannot do, whether it's invisibility, levitation, anything. The reason he cannot do these things is because the party doesn't allow him to do these things. O'Brien goes on to state that Winston must get rid of the 19th century ideas about laws of nature. O'Brien states the party makes the laws of nature. This is where Winston rebuttals, no, you do not. You aren't even masters of this planet. Winston asks about Eurasia and East Asia, and if they do own the planet, how come they haven't conquered those other nations yet? To which O'Brien states, all of that is not important. They'll conquer them when they need to and when it suits them. And besides, what difference would it make anyway? O'Brien states they can shut them out of existence entirely. They can tell people of Oceania that Oceania is the entire world. Winston goes on to state, but the world itself is only a speck of dust, and man is tiny and helpless. Winston goes on to state that for millions of years the Earth wasn't inhabited. This is where O'Brien becomes upset and states back, nonsense, the Earth is as old as we say it is, and no older. He says that nothing exists except through human consciousness. Winston states, the rocks are full of bones of extinct animals, of mammoths and mastodons and enormous reptiles who lived here long before man was ever heard of. O'Brien comes back at him and says, but you haven't seen those bones, have you? And of course not. 19th century biologists invented them. Before man, there was nothing. After man, if he could come to an end, would be nothing. Outside of man, there is nothing. Winston states, but the whole universe is outside of us. Look at the stars. Some of them are 1,000,000 light years away and they're out of reach forever. O'Brien indefinitely just states, what are the stars? They're bits of fire a few kilometers away, and we could easily reach out and touch them if we wanted to. Or we could blot them out. The Earth is the center of the universe. The sun and stars go around it. At this time, Winston begins to writhe in pain because O'Brien turns the dial up. O'Brien doesn't even let Winston try to catch his breath and continues on speaking. He states for certain purposes, of course, that is not true. But when we navigate the ocean, when we predict an eclipse, when we often find it convenient to assume that the Earth goes around the sun and the stars are millions upon millions of kilometers away, then that's it. He asked Winston if he supposes it's beyond the realm of the party to produce a dual system of astronomy. He goes on to state that the stars can be near or distant according to the party and how they need it to be. He said, do you suppose our mathematics are unequal to that? Have you forgotten doublethink? As O'Brien is stating all of this, Winston just shrinks back into the bed, but as he does, he kept thinking that he knew something was not right. The belief that nothing exists outside of your own mind, surely there must be some way of demonstrating it, that it was false. Has this not been exposed long ago as a fallacy? As he's thinking all of this, O'Brien looks down and begins to smile, and tells Winston, I told you metaphysics is not your strong point. The word you're trying to think of is solipsism. O'Brien goes on and tells Winston that actually doesn't exist, and that just the opposite does. All of its digressions. He states that the real power, the power we have to fight for night and day, is not the power over things, but over man. O'Brien asks, how does one man assert his power over another? Winston states, by making him suffer. O'Brien states, exactly. Obedience is not enough unless he's suffering, and how can you be sure he's obeying your will and not his own? Power is inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in a new shape of your own choosing. He then asks Winston, do you not see what kind of world we are creating? He goes on to state that it is exactly opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that older oligarchies imagined. Instead, it's a world of fear and treachery and torment, a world of trampling and being trampled upon, the world which will not grow less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress of our world will be progressed towards more pain. Oberyn then goes on to state how they already are starting this form of thought and training of people who lose their sense of being human. At this point, they are able to destroy the threads of family and partners. Oberyn exclaims that they are able to rip the family unit apart at this moment by pitting child against parent, man against woman, and man against man. He states that soon enough, babies will be taken from their mothers as one collects eggs from a chicken, and that sex will be eradicated, or at least the instinct of it. Procreation will be an annual formality like the renewal of a ration. Their goal is to abolish the organism. They're trying to create a society where there is no loyalty except for the party. There is no love except towards Big Brother. There is no laughter except the laughter of triumph over defeated enemies. There will be no arts, no literature, no science, because they're omnipresent. There is no need of it. Towards the end of this speech, he goes on to state, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Oberyn goes on to state that the party will become so powerful because it will control everything, even the revolutions and the espionage and the spies, and they will continue to do the process in which he is doing to Winston for ages to come. Make people believe that there is something else, but then all of them will end up the same way as Winston, being in the ministry of love, being tortured and ridiculed and humiliated until they're groveling on their knees to be let back into society and for the pain to be over. That is how they will succeed in converting everyone into the society. Winston responds, "You can't. You can't create such a world as you have just described. It's a dream. It's impossible." Oberyn asks, "Why?" And Winston states, "It's impossible to found a civilization on fear and hatred and cruelty. It will never endure." Oberyn asks, "Why not?" And Winston says, "It would have no vitality. It would disintegrate. It would commit suicide." Oberyn goes back to trying to defend the party and the party's logic, and as Winston just begins to shrivel back onto the bed, Winston knew that it was no use in trying to fight back against what Oberyn was saying. Winston finally states, "I don't know how, and I don't care. Somehow you will fail. Something will defeat you. Life will defeat you." Oberyn interjects, "We control life, Winston, at all levels. You are imagining that there is something called human nature, which will be outraged by what we do, and will turn against us. But we create human nature, Winston. Men are infinitely malleable." Oberyn goes on to state, "Humanity is the party. The others are irrelevant." Winston doesn't give up so easily and says that he doesn't care, and that in the end, they will beat him. Sooner or later, they will see you for what you are, and they will tear you to pieces. Both of them go on to have an argument where Winston tells Oberyn that he will be stopped at some point, whether or not directly by Oberyn himself. But Winston just has this feeling, and he knows the party will fail, that there is something in the universe or spirit or principle that the party will never be able to overcome. Oberyn asks Winston, "Do you believe in God?" And Winston says, "No." Oberyn asks, "Do you consider yourself a man?" And Winston says, "Yes." Oberyn says, "If you're a man, Winston, then you are the last man of your kind, of this extinct inheritor." Oberyn asks, "You consider yourself morally superior to us, with our lives and our cruelty?" To which Winston responds, "Yes, I consider myself superior." Oberyn didn't speak at that moment. Two other voices were speaking. And after a moment, Winston recognized one of those voices as his own. It was the soundtrack of the conversation he had had with Oberyn the night that he had rolled himself in the Brotherhood. After a little bit, they turned the conversation off and the voices stopped. Oberyn tells him to get out of bed, and he does. Oberyn states, "Winston, you are the last man. You are the guardian of the human spirit. You shall see yourself as you are. Take off your clothes." Winston does without any hesitation, and Oberyn tells him to go to the mirror and see himself from every angle. As Winston is getting to the mirror, what he sees reflected back is nothing that looks like his former self. In fact, Winston describes what is moving towards the mirror as a skeleton of a creature that is beyond grade and disintegrated. The eyes had sunken in, the mouth became thin, he had become so skinny you could put your thumb and forefinger around his bicep. His knees were thicker than his thighs, the ulcer on his leg was red and scaly, and skin was falling off from it. All in all, he looked like a horrible creature suffering from some malignant disease. Oberyn goes on to torture Winston just a little bit more and trying to break him down through words, stating the human spirit has disintegrated, and that now Winston looks malignant. He goes on to make fun of how Winston looks, how skinny he's become, how his teeth are falling out, and at that moment, when he mentions his teeth, Oberyn reaches into Winston's mouth and pulls out the last remaining tooth by the roots and throws it across the room. After all of this, Oberyn tells Winston to put his clothes back on, and Winston does and begins to cry. Winston states to Oberyn, "You did this. You reduced me to this state. To which Oberyn responds, no, Winston, you reduced it to yourself. This is what you accepted when you set yourself up against the party. Nothing has happened here that you did not foresee. Oberyn goes back to condemning Winston, and at the final question he asks Winston is, can you think of a single degradation that has not happened to you? To which Winston responds, I have not betrayed Julia. Oberyn responds with, no, that is perfectly true. You have not betrayed Julia. When Oberyn states this, the peculiar reference for Oberyn flooded Winston's heart again, because Winston knew that other men would have said the opposite and would have said he had betrayed Julia. Winston knew that even though he told them all of the secrets, the histories of Julia, and everything that happened between them, Winston still loved Julia, and he never stopped loving her. The feelings towards her remained the same. Oberyn knew this without needing an explanation. And that is why Winston feels the way he does towards Oberyn. Winston asks, how soon will it be until they shoot him? Oberyn states, there could be a long time. When things are difficult, don't give up hope. Everyone is cured sooner or later. In the end, we shall shoot you. This is where Chapter 3, Part 3 ends. Join us in the next video as we go over Chapter 4. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.